rulers have also often leveraged their international position and political importance to Great Britain, the United States, and South Asian Muslims to win assistance and funds akin to the rents that they would later receive from oil. In fact, Saudi Arabia's dependence on the annual fees paid by Hajj pilgrims in the 1930s and 1940s resembled the kingdom's later dependence on the proceeds from the sale of oil. Significantly, the oil industry that took hold in Saudi Arabia in its neighbors reflected a nexus of technological and social factors that was every bit as global as the Hajj pilgrimage. To begin with, in 1912, the British Admiralty turned oil into the most prized strategic commodity in the world by transforming the fuel that British fleets used from coal to oil. In a single stroke, Great Britain ensured that the Arab Gulf would play a paramount role in global affairs over the next century. Equally important were the economic and cultural factors after 1945 that intensified energy consumption while limiting the use of coal, especially in North America and Western Europe. These factors included shortages of coal after the war, an enormous global increase in the number of automobiles, solid economic growth, and public outcries in major American and European cities about pollution from coal. The following statistics suggest how dramatic of a shift in international transformation this was. In 1950, coal provided 3/4 of the energy for the Western world, whereas oil provided just 23%. By the 1970s, oil provided 60% of the West's energy needs, whereas coal provided just 22%. Thanks to these changes, Saudi Arabia and its neighbors would grow wealthy and emerge as key centers in the global economy. Yet, the modern oil industry was not just oil rigs and tankers. It arose in a society that utilized a host of other technological advances, which have had at least as important an effect on oil as on the politics of the Gulf. These new technologies permitted Gulf governments to build massive new cities modeled on post-war U.S. suburbs, increase the number of foreign and domestic populations, and achieve rapid economic growth. And here, air conditioning was especially significant since it permitted people, particularly foreigners, to live in the region year-round without suffering the destabilizing effects of prolonged exposure to extreme heat. And it's also going to reduce the incidence of illness to those on par with incidence of illness in Europe and North America. I want to stop for a moment to explain just how important this was. In the 19th century up to the first decades of the 20th century, if you're a British diplomat, you do not want to be assigned to this region. Why? It was known as the white man's graveyard. Research has shown in recent years that virtually every single British official sent to this part of the world before the 1930s suffered either debilitating disease or died. It's not a place you wanted to go. The change in the 1930s is significant because that's with the onset of air conditioning. And indeed, a British report from the period noted that air conditioning added alone 2 to 3 hours a day of extra productivity to a day. That's a major impact. Still, none of these changes were enough, however, to convince Arab Gulf nationals that the socio-economic and political structures of their societies had changed beyond all recognition. Although the outside world may have increasingly seen these states chiefly through the lens of petroleum, Arabs in the Gulf no more defined their communities through the lens of oil than did Europeans, Americans, and others who lived in societies in which oil had become central to every facet of daily life after World War II. Instead, Gulf Arabs saw these changes as so tentative that they could easily re-embrace the Bedouin lifestyle of their fathers and grandfathers. This view emerged in a saying common in the Gulf in the 1970s. My father rode a camel, I ride a Cadillac. My son flies a jet. My grandson will have a supersonic plane. But my great-grandson, he will be a camel driver. The debate over the political structure and future of Gulf societies has played out for decades in the region's mass media. Following World War I, radios became very popular in the Gulf. They were easily transportable and provided information to people who were both semi-literate and, with rare exceptions, without access to daily newspapers. Television appeared in the 1950s and became as much an aspect of daily life in the region as the call to prayer and Quran readings. From the start, Gulf states treated mass media as an aspect of state sovereignty and competed fiercely with each other and others, including private oil companies, Arab nationalists, even U.S. regional military bases, for stations and channels. The result was that the Arabs in this region, much like Germans during the Cold War, had access to broadcasts in their native languages from terrestrial radio and television stations based in neighboring states. Although regional governments censored domestic radio and television content whenever they could, they did not, in fact, control everything that was broadcast within their national borders. Instead, they were forced to compete for domestic audiences, which overwhelmingly preferred foreign television and radio broadcasts. After Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in 1990, the media framework in the Gulf underwent a shift as profound as the introduction of radios. This new framework coincided with the rise of satellite television networks like Al Jazeera, modeled on the cable news network. It altered which foreign and domestic groups could demand access to state resources and also ensured that government decisions had to respect the interests and views of these groups. The media, foreign and Gulf-based, often pursued their own agenda and were sometimes funded by governments or organizations that differed considerably from the official voice of many Gulf states. The internet and new television media gave a platform as well to dissonant Gulf and Arab voices and often employed, and this is key, Western-trained, Arabic-speaking journalists. Unlike American or European journalists, these journalists did not depend on local, often government-appointed, guides and translators. They could follow a story wherever it naturally led without fear. If that meant interviewing bin Laden, covering anti-U.S. protests, or discussing long taboo subjects, stories went on the air. Fortunately, the new Arab satellite networks had many new stories to cover. To begin with, the decision of the Gulf states to maintain even closer ties with the United States after the Gulf War may have deterred Iran or Iraq from attacking them, but it also enraged important segments of Gulf public opinion, convincing some to support al-Qaeda and other organizations dedicated to using violence to overthrow regional regimes. Initiatives designed to reduce the dependence of Gulf economies on the proceeds from exporting oil joined with an influx of labor to reopen social divisions, since few Gulf nationals were qualified to work in the positions created by the booming private sector. An exception, and among the beneficiaries of the Gulf's investments in these non-oil industries and the social issues that they spawned, were women, since many of them had the modern skills to work in the private sector. They had benefited far more than men from the massive investments that Gulf governments had made in education starting in the 1970s. Since younger women, on average, are more literate, perform better academically, stay in school longer than their male counterparts, this gap is certainly likely to widen in the future. Already, women account for 2/3 of the students in many Gulf universities. They've taken leadership positions that you see here. In fact, in Kuwait, women's success has been a political issue. Women's success in college is a political issue, with Islamist politicians claiming that it's unfair and demeaning for men to have to compete with women in university. They're just too good.